Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. So glad you're joining us on the Crossways podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Germany, and we're broadcasting live from Holly Hill Church of Christ. And with me, I got my good friend, Logan Richardson, with me, and we'll be discussing what it means or what goodness is really all about. So, Logan, it's good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Like I was telling you earlier, I'm in Texas now, and Texas is cool. So life is cool.
Is everything bigger in Texas?
100%. Sky, roads, cars, trucks, everything.
Everything's bigger.
Yep.
I interned in Texas for my first internship.
I did
I
not.
didn't tell you that. I was in let's see, a place called Holly Lake Ranch. It was about 30 miles north of Tyler, Texas, and the rose capital of the world. They have lots of roses there. In case you know, rose capital, a lot of roses. It was really interesting. They had like, you know how they have people who sell like random stuff out of their trucks, you know, in other states. No, they had people selling like, I have 100 dozen roses in my truck. You want some for like $5? I was like, sure, I'll take some roses. Catherine was coming to visit, and I was like, I'll just buy a bunch of roses. And I think I did that. Maybe I'm making that up. You'd have to ask her.
It would make
And
sense. If you were
yeah,
ever going to do it, you should do it when they're like $5. Just don't tell them.
absolutely. Yeah, they're normally like 25 bucks a dozen or something crazy like that. But no, I had a good time there. It was a lot of retirees, I believe, from the Dallas area moved in that area, so it was really cool. But you are now, I said, a freshman at Freed Hardman. It's
Yep.
hard to imagine
Freshman year.
because I think was it 2000? Let's see, 2010. I think I did my internship in Seneca,
Yep, that sounds right.
and where I got to meet you and your family, and that was a fun experience, and I enjoyed that summer. And at your dad was a few weeks ago on our podcast,
Yep.
and I had to keep the tradition. We had to have more Richardson. You know, unfortunately, it's a
I
lot
don't
of
know what made you think that was a good idea, but if
well,
it's
this
keep it up.
well, we have a lot of Clemson now, and I'm like, oh no, I don't know how I feel about this, and
I shouldn't be wearing the Brave shirt. I should be wearing the Clemson shirt. What was I thinking?
I'm glad you're choosing not to.
Man.
And even though I don't like the Braves, I can't say much though. I'm an Astros fan, and apparently we're talking about goodness in a little bit, and I'm not sure goodness and Astros really go hand in hand right now. I
Yeah.
mean,
Not
I like my boy Bregman. You know, Bregman's an LSU guy, and I like his apology. He said, "I'm sorry." You know, it's pretty generic. You know, I was like, I like that guy. He has his, he's an interesting fella. But we are talking about goodness. You saw that transition there. You
that was
know,
good.
that was pretty smooth.
It
But
was.
as we're thinking about goodness, we just talked about kindness last week, and I know Doug did a good job, and I'm thankful for him. And Doug was our minister growing up in Baton Rouge, and then I got to see him and at Freed Hardeman. But we talked a lot about what kindness really was. And last week we said kindness was, and I like the definition of the humbling giving of ourselves to others.
Mhm.
People who don't maybe deserve it, who won't thank us for it, and what was the other one? I'm forgetting the definition. That's awful. But a lot of times we kind of confuse kindness and goodness as almost being the same thing,
Mhm.
and they're really not. And I know you and I were talking about this before, and I liked how you were talking about that. And and I love for those who are watching live, tell us what you think goodness really is, and maybe why it's different than kindness. And Logan, you had some pretty good thoughts earlier before we went live.
Yeah. It seems like and watching the one from last week too with Doug. Kindness seemed to be this action. Kind. Doug actually mentioned something that they do at their congregation, Estes, that they do random acts of kindness. It's kind of, we use that phrase, acts of kindness, and it kind of is that. Kindness is something that you're doing, and I feel like goodness is more of an intrinsic value of something. If something is good, it's not that it's doing something to be good; it's that it is good, and that's what we see throughout Scripture too. And there's a lot of different verses that kind of back up that biblical idea of goodness, that state of being.
Absolutely. Kindness is part of is kind of a lifestyle where we're trying to, be kind to others. And it seems a lot of kindness is directed toward others. And I think goodness is more inward focus in the sense of not me focused, but am I being just good? And what
Hmm.
does that mean? And I looked at some definitions, and according to some linguists, it says goodness is more of a moral judgment, behavior. Goodness is striving to achieve good. Some good moral behaviors and ideas. So it seems that it's almost a way of being, not just a lifestyle about how we treat others, how we interact with those around us. But goodness is really just who we are, and this podcast is about, being more like Christ. And that's a transformation, each and every day. And here, a minister, a friend of mine, Josh Fowler, said goodness deals more with that core value. He says kindness is maybe an expression of that goodness. And I can see that for sure, because if we have that good moral behavior, if we have that core value, we're going to be kind to others because of our goodness, because it's right. Just because someone treated us poorly, or maybe just because someone did something that was not appropriate, doesn't give us the right to treat them poorly.
Right.
Doesn't matter what they did before. What matters is now, how am I going to treat them now?
And I think
I'm
that is shown in God a lot through Scripture and through what we'll see in a lot of these verses. Is it's that, yeah, He has that part of Him that is who He is, and then it's shown in things like kindness and mercy, and it's because of that goodness that is a part of Him. Yeah.
definitely, Psalm 100, says, "For the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations." Those are
Hmm.
three things. Because he is good, it's not he's being good. It's not
Right.
a description of his action. It's a description of his nature. His
Hmm.
what Josh said here. His core value. The Lord is good, and because of that goodness, his steadfast love toward us endures forever. And then what? God's faithfulness.
Hmm.
We don't think about God's faithfulness very often. We think of our faithfulness.
Hmm.
And Travis says hi, by the way. So Travis Creasy.
Oh, hey, Gracie.
But I think those are things we have to really understand. Like what Romans is saying. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Why? That the testing of the testing you may discern what the will of God is, and what is good and acceptable and perfect. And I
Yep.
think that's what we have to. That's what we're all about. Is if we're trying to have good fruit, goodness has to be a part of it, which means we have to have those intrinsic core values that Josh was talking about.
You mentioned Psalm 100, and it made me think of Psalm 23 too. You got the last verse, I think verse 6 of Psalm 23. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me. But the beginning of that, is talking about how, because he's the whole psalm, because he's being guided by God, and because he's being led by God, then those attributes are going to follow him in his life. Those attributes that come from who's guiding him and who's leading him, and that's how goodness and mercy follow him, because those traits come from the one who's leading.
Yeah, I think I like what you brought up there, because that means we not only, we're supposed to be being led by God, but that means we have to allow ourselves to be led.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, oh, I'm going to be good myself. No, no.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be kind myself. I'm going to be, without God, all of it falls apart.
Right.
And here, like the whole Psalm 23 passage says, he is my shepherd, which means he is now who I'm following. And I should know his voice and not follow any other voices. I heard someone once say they asked a shepherd, because they said a lot of shepherds would come and their flock would mingle in the, I don't know, not, I guess, meadow, field, plain, the grass field to eat food. That they would be munching on whatever they were munching on. And he said, how do you know which ones are yours once they all kind of mingle together and there's multiple herds? And he said, because they know my voice.
Mm-hmm.
And when Jesus says, the sheep will know the shepherd's voice, he was using an actual pretty good analogy, because then
Mm-hmm.
they each made their own, I don't know what kind of call or sound, and then all the sheep kind of went toward their shepherd as they left. I was like, that's pretty cool. I mean, sheep aren't the smartest, but sheep know that much. And so, hi, Paul. But yeah,
Probably need to go through and research some more stuff about sheep and shepherding before we have this conversation.
I should have, but that's about all I know. That's all
I
I
didn't think
know.
about it either. I mean,
But as we're talking about goodness, and we would love for, again, those who are watching to kind of help us figure out what that goodness is, and how, not just how God displays his goodness to us, but how can we embrace God's goodness and make it part of our core value, like Josh was saying. That way kindness can be that expression. So love can grow out of that goodness. And I think, there's lots of people we could look at in the Bible, but before we get there, I think we have to mention Ephesians chapter 2. I think we have to look at Ephesians 2, and maybe even, yeah, where Paul's writing and he's saying, we are his workmanship. I like the translation that says we are his masterpiece. We are his prized creation. We are, the Michelangelo statue. We are the Mona Lisa. We are Starry Night. No, we are his prized creation, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Again, for good works. We are created to be good. We were created to become, or really to be like Christ, to be like God in his image. And I know you and I were talking about that before we got on, and I'll let you kind of take it away with what you have here.
yeah, and in back to Psalm 23 too. You've got the idea that he's following the shepherd, and he kind of not only does it's almost the idea that not only do the traits of the shepherd follow the psalmist, but that he kind of replicates that and he seeks that. They're following him and he's looking for it, and he repeats that throughout many of the other psalms. In terms of being created, goodness, we go back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. You think about all of the times. I mean, I think I counted maybe 14 times that that the word good is used in Genesis 1 and 2 about God's creation. So he made this thing that came from him. Again, the idea of the source and that being part of who he is. He made these things, and because they came from him who is good, they themselves are also good. And that created this world that we see. And that's why we say, that the world wasn't made corrupt, because the world came from a good God, and the good God can only make good things.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned when we were talking, because we were created good, but then there seemed to be, after the fall, how long was it before goodness was mentioned again?
Yeah, it was like there were a couple of maybe sporadic mentions of the word, but it wasn't in a positive sense. So in chapter 1 and 2, we've got all these instances of the writer using the word good to describe God's creation.
Yeah.
And then we have a big period of probably until I think I found 26. So chapter 26, it's not used in a positive connotation for that many chapters. 23 chapter break. In there are a couple times, but it's always used in terms of like something looked good to eat or good to the eyes or something. So it's not really. It's more of a lustful good than it is intrinsically like part of what it is. So that it's almost after chapter 3, it just changed everything, because God made things good, and then humans went and messed that up. Then it fundamentally changed the earth, the creation, and everything that was good at that one time. It's like it had been defiled.
Yeah. Well, goodness was no, it wasn't good anymore because man ceased to listen to God. Paul mentioned here, hey Paul, he said sheep are not the sharpest animals in the animal pool. He goes, that's why we need a shepherd. And he mentioned John 10:20-30 about if we listen to him, we will follow him. If we listen to him and if we follow him, no matter what, we will be protected. And, you see in the beginning, what chapter, 1, 2, 3, you had the perfect creation, God's plan A, which was man in the garden, him walking with man, perfectness. Mm-hmm. And then man decided, and with one rule really, well, a couple rules, be fruitful and multiply, till the ground and don't eat that tree. Okay, so one restrictive rule: don't eat that tree. Right? That's a pretty simple rule, you would think. But the minute they decided we don't need to listen to God, we'll listen to this other, voice telling us kind of what man has wanted all along and what man still wants. God just doesn't want you to be like him. You can be more powerful. Life's all about you. Doesn't it look good? It's yours. Have it. You're not really going to die, and all these things. And instead, they lost sight of who they were following. They lost sight of goodness because of what appeared to be good to the eyes. So sometimes what we perceive as being good may not actually be good. Things that we say, oh, this looks good, when we start to think selfishly and say, that's when goodness starts to get more muddy instead of actually following what God says is good.
Right. Because goodness comes from godly characteristics, selfishness is not a godly characteristic. Therefore, it's not good. And that's also this whole thing of kind of the creation, God creating things and them being good, is a theme through the rest of Scripture too. We go back to Romans chapter 12. You think about the words it's using. It's talking about transformation and renewal, and that's how you determine what's good. It's by completely changing this messed up state that we're in. You have to completely change that before you can know what is good and acceptable and perfect. Another thing, in I think it's 1 Peter 4:19. We've got an example where Peter says, we've got to entrust our souls to a creator, to a faithful creator, while doing good. Again, he could have said just trust our souls to God, but for some reason he chose creator. And so it's interesting that this is kind of intentionally carried out, that creation, renewal, regeneration, transformation is linked with being good. And that's how you find that again.
Definitely. And I want to switch gears a little bit to look at maybe an example of someone who I think was a great example of what it means to be good, or what it means to exemplify goodness. And he's one of my favorite characters in really the whole Bible, which is Josiah. Josiah was one of the youngest kings. We know that. And he became king when he was just 8 years old. And if my math serves me correctly, when he was 26, so that would be 18 years into his reign. If I'm not the best math person,
No.
yes, it sounds better, Caleb. I had my computer audio on and the mic was picking it up. So if there were some issues, hopefully y'all can hear it better now. And but hopefully into his kingship, something happened, and that's where I think we want to focus on, which was Josiah and them. They were cleaning out, and they found the book of the law, and they all of a sudden went, "What's this?"
Ooh.
And I think that's kind of absurd. If we think about that, to try to what would that be like today? That would be like someone finding a church building that was full of junk, cleaning it out, finding a Bible, and saying, "We've never seen this before. What is this?" I mean, now we have the Bible printed more frequently, so it's not quite the same, but it's that big of a deal. It was the book of the law. And they went, "We need to figure out this." So upon reading it, Josiah figured out, we're not doing anything correct. We've been ignoring what God has commanded for a long time now. And instead of just saying, this is going to become a problem and for my power, so let's just act like we didn't find anything, which could have been very easily done.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, Josh. And Josh has distracted me with his comments. They decided, we're going to take what this book said and we're going to implement all these things and make a covenant with the Lord. So Josiah started by example by saying, we've messed up, and not just we, but I've not done this right either. But from now on, I'm dedicating myself to the Lord. You need to do the same, and here's what we're doing. We're going to start doing this. We're going to clean out these people, all these idols. You're out of here. All these, other things. Y'all are out. we're going to do things the right way. And that could have caused him a lot of problems. But because he did that, the people followed, at least for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And the gods delayed some of the consequences until Josiah, passed. But I think that shows us what goodness is really all about, is making sure that we are doing what's right always.
Mm-hmm.
And that might mean that we don't benefit from it. That might mean that we have to change everything we're doing. And that's why I like Josiah, because that means goodness is a way of life. It is that core value that Josh was talking about. That goodness has to be that core value that guides our life. We were created for good works, not for personal gain.
Right. And Josiah, you think about the steps that he took. It was to clean out the temple of what was impure, and it was to get rid of the places of worship for other gods. And he took all of those things and whittled it back down to what God would want him to do. And so, I think, again, this would also be a theme of goodness being kind of a purity. Goodness is, God is pure. Obviously, two different words, but we talk about a lot of these fruits of the Spirit kind of meshing together, and a lot of words meshing together. But, he did these things to kind of purify the temple, to get it back to what it should be, to what it was created for. And it had been muddied throughout the process. And he did these things in order to make it good again.
Definitely.
To draw closer to God, too. I mean, that was just the fundamental principle behind it. It was to not just make the temple easier to walk through, because there's not just a ton of idols there. It was because in his goodness, he wanted to find the goodness of God through worshiping him and through leading the nation of Israel back to him.
Definitely. And and this is also, I love to hear, our audience is a little more chatty than usual, which is great. And I like to hear us talk about now why it seems goodness is so hard to not obtain, but I would say to possess. Because it's not something we go out and we're going to find. It's something we have to possess as a core value. And I think it's something we mentioned earlier, which was just selfishness. Whenever we want to do things our way, I don't think goodness can really exist. Now, if our way matches God's way, then sure, goodness can exist. But if we leave God out of the picture, goodness doesn't exist anywhere where God isn't present. Mm-hmm. And too often we allow kind of our own desires to say, well, sure, I know I'm supposed to do this, or sure, I know this is maybe a good thing to do, but what I want to do, is it really harmful? And we start to kind of play that justification game, where if it doesn't really seem harmful, and if it's not really going to hurt anybody, why can't I do it? And that's a dangerous game to play, especially when we see it today. It really does affect everybody, and we may not really realize how it affects people.
And that goes all the way back to Genesis. That was exactly what happened to them. They were this one thing, and that when they tried to be self-seeking, that's when that goodness was muddied. And I like how you said, without God, you can't find that goodness, because it is intrinsically in Him. I was looking over my page of notes right when you said that. Titus 1:16 talks about, because they, certain group of people denied Him, they were unfit for any good work, is what the verse says. So because they set God aside, that made them unfit for anything good, because without God, there is no good.
Definitely. And it's kind of like what my dad just put in here. Hi, Dad. He said, God is good. The Spirit lives in us, and goes, and if, like Paul, we get to the point of being able to say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ that lives in me, then goodness will be what we are. And right. I think that has to be it. My desires have to become God's desires. Mm-hmm. And now, does that mean we're going to be perfect every time? Well, of course not. And that's why I'm thankful for grace. That's why I'm thankful for mercy and forgiveness and the blood of Christ. That's why Christ came to die for us. But hopefully I can say, hey, I'm going to, and how do we do that? Well, that's a daily transformation. It's
Yeah.
not something that happens immediately. It's not something that we can say, I've arrived. There's some things that I like to say whenever something's happened that I can say, man, this happened, which means I must have arrived by now. But it doesn't work that way in Christianity. It doesn't work that way when in transformation. We've never fully arrived yet.
Right.
We only fully arrived whenever we get our reward in heaven.
Exactly.
And but we have to be able to say, it's no longer me anymore. It's not
Right.
about me.
And again, just to reinforce the point, why is it that, once we get that, we've reached that point when we get our reward, again, because we're with God. And that's the reason. That's behind it all.
And then it's good again.
Right.
Then it's like the garden again, because now
Because,
it's been restored.
right, because of that restoration and that renewal and everything that's been this through the whole thing.
Definitely.
From Eden all the way to Romans to Ephesians and everything.
Definitely. And I think as we look at all of this, I think that the point has to be goodness really means, Christ-like.
Yeah.
Goodness is God, godlike, godly. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. It's one of the, oh man, it's been a day. And but it's not ever that selfishness. It's not ever me.
Right.
And we live in a world that's in a society that says it is all about you.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to listen to others. It doesn't matter how you treat others. And goodness, I think we'll to see goodness in how we also treat others. Like I think Doug was last week saying, fruit of the spirits don't just fruit of the spirit. Sorry, don't these characteristics don't just stop. Love doesn't isn't from here to here, and then joy picks up, and then peace. They're not in blocks. They're almost meshed together, and that's why you can't have one without the other. If say I can't have love without being good. I can't have love without being peaceable. I can't have love without patience.
Right. And you can't be good without love and without patience.
Exactly. So how we interact with others, and we're about out of time, so I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I think it needs to be said, especially with recent events, how we treat others is important, and how we interact with others is important.
Absolutely.
And being godly means we have to stand up for things, and we have to say, hey, this isn't right, and I'm going to be godly, and I'm going to mourn with those who mourn, weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice, but above all, I'm going to be Christ-like. And if someone kind of interact with me poorly, well, I'm going to respond lovingly. Christ on the cross was still saying, what? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And we need to embrace that type of attitude, but we also need to remember that, we need to embrace also just justice, goodness, love, and mercy.
Yep.
And all those things will, because people will then, they'll know us by our love, and that's how we can win the world.
Micah 6:8. Have I not told you, oh man, what is good? And goodness involved, justice, mercy, and things like that. So
definitely
wrapped up together.
Well, Logan, I'm so glad you've joined me. Do you have any closing thoughts before we tell our audience farewell?
You may just kick me off early for this. I don't know, but go Tigers.
Oh, hey, I can get on board with that.
Go Tigers. GOTIGERS.
Okay, so not go Tigers.
Okay. Man, I realize I can't do that with you.
You can't do that with me. Yep, but that's, what, I'll accept it. But hey guys, I'm so glad you joined us. And remember, we're here every Thursday, and right here on the Crossways podcast at 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. And these videos are always brought to you by Holly Hill Church of Christ and Adventures. I'm sorry, no, I did it again. And Ministry League. Oh man, I have to put money in the jar again. Guys, you have a good week, and we will talk to you guys later.